Hello everyone and welcome to this video. Today I'm going to be giving you a sneak peek behind the scenes or behind the product of my new plugin called SuffixSlayer. If you're not already familiar, SuffixSlayer is an After Effects general plugin which appears under the composition menu, and you can either enable or disable it. When it's enabled, it's always looking inside of your render queue, waiting for an image to be exported. The main goal of it is to simply remove the annoying frame suffix added to the end of any individual frame exports. So if I disable it, add a single framed composition to my render queue, and then render it, you can see, like usual, when we export an image or image sequence, it has this suffix, and you might have to find yourself going in and removing it yourself like this. And if you have a whole bunch of renders, that can get really tedious. So the goal is to just have this simple thing here, listening. If you have it selected like this, it's now checked, and listening for when we add and render an individual frame to remove the suffix of the frame. This is just a super simple tool that is always there listening, but let's go ahead and dive into a little more of the details about the development and how it works. So first, the idea came to me about a month ago, and it's taken less than a month to make this plugin come to fruition. But despite the simplicity, there's a lot of complexities that went into it, like how to make it future-proof. For example, if we dip into scripting or extensions on top of the plugin, is that going to be future-proof in several years when UXP comes out? Another tricky thing that had to be figured out is how often and how are we going to be looking and listening to the render queue, and how will we know when there's a single image being exported out of the render queue? Because if I didn't mention already, which I did in my last video, the SuffixSlayer plugin will respect if you have a longer than one frame video export. The SuffixSlayer is only designed to remove the suffix from individual frame exports. If you have an image sequence with lots of frames, you want to retain that suffix to put them back together in whatever your workflow is. So the idea came to me as I was struggling to work on another plugin that I've been working on, which is a sort of LUT tool that I won't reveal too much about. But in the midst of a really hard project, I was just sitting there and I had this idea: why not make another After Effects general plugin, which we can add to the menu, and instead of just having a button that executes some code, why not use something that I was familiar with, this enable and disable feature, to sort of toggle a feature. So I thought, why not create something that just enhances After Effects and is something that I find annoying, whether I'm exporting YouTube thumbnails or individual images that I've photoshopped in After Effects. Why not have something that is just there to give us a feature that After Effects doesn't have? There's no way to disable that frame suffix export, and it can be annoying and also just visually unpleasant to look at the frame suffix on top of an image. So in the throes of being frustrated from another plugin that I'm working on and thought I would finish months ago, I thought, let's pivot and create something simple. So I have this plugin idea, and the concept is that nobody likes to export a single image out of After Effects, then have to go modify the suffix with the zeros at the end of it, showing the frame numbers. So why not make an After Effects general plugin, which is a check on or check on ability, and what it will do is, if it's checked on, it will prevent that suffix from being added. I'm going to double check, of course, that you can't just change a setting or in your render settings to modify this option, otherwise the point would be to just use that. But if it's not possible to have a plugin, After Effects general plugin, that has a Boolean true or false to remove that suffix or keep it. And I've already done a bit of experimentation. The checkbox thing is totally possible. You just enable true or false. The tricky thing is the way that it's going to rename it. How does it know when a render is initiated and complete? You can't really run a script to check such a thing. There are some built-in things to AEGPs, like the menu command change, where something is initialized in After Effects and it sends a trigger entry point to the AEGP, and from there you can toggle settings and check things. For example, if you're using like Find My AEP, an AEGP I made, you can't click the button if there's no project loaded. So what it does is every time there's an update received, is it checks if there's an active project. If there's not, it disables it. So I need some way to detect if you can actually detect when something is rendered, or to create some kind of set interval with the plugin. So I recorded that about a month ago, and the idea was almost just to be like a note for myself, working through the logic. The idea initially was there to make an AEGP. That's kind of my thing these days, is to create these extended functions inside of After Effects. But then I thought about it. A lot of the AEGPs that I do make also interact with scripts to enhance their functionality. Like my last product, Quick Link Items, it's an After Effects general plugin as well, but it leverages scripting in order to execute After Effects code. It uses C++ to do a lot of file searching and quick things like that, but it actually runs two different scripts. And with the time we're in now, we know that UXP is going to be coming into the future, and we're not sure how long that's going to take. And if I make something with the script, I'm probably going to have to update it if UXP overwrites the existing scripting language. So Quick Link Items probably is going to require a update in the future once UXP is fully implemented and if the old scripting is gone. So one idea I had is that I want this to be out there and I don't want to have to touch it as much as usual. Obviously there might be bugs for certain cases, but the idea is to not have it all of a sudden become obsolete and then all of a sudden in the middle of the night everyone's product breaks. So how could I make it future proof? AEGPs seem future proof enough, but if I'm running scripts, it's not future proof necessarily. So the key was to have all of the code be AEGP code, no scripts. AEGP does have access to a lot of things, and you can do things like get compositions, layers, get the times, the names, all kinds of stuff like that. So that was the key, is even though it's more complicated and harder than scripting, I needed to use pure C++ code in order to execute certain things. But the first trick was to figure out the interval. Am I gonna check to see if something needs to be rendered and renamed every second, every minute, every 0.1 seconds? How often and how am I gonna check to identify when this plugin needs to rename files? Because ultimately that's what it is. It's a file renamer, but it also has to update things and listen every so often. So if you're not already familiar with After Effects general plugins, there are these things called entry points. One of the entry points is the actual thing that happens when you click on the menu item. In this case, when you click on the menu item, it enables or disables it. It does this by just writing to a file and remembering that. Then there's also something called an update menu hook. This is something that's executed every time After Effects receives a sort of update information. For example, a previous AEGP I made called Find My AEP makes this reveal project and explore icon here. Right now it's grayed out because it's detected there's no project, but it's constantly listening so that if I load up a different menu or execute something in After Effects, it continually checks, is there an open project now? And if there is an open project, it then enables it. So this update menu hook was my first lead to think of, okay, if we get this update, maybe the user clicks on something, maybe they toggle a menu, then we can detect, is there something in the render queue? Maybe right now there's not, but maybe if they add something to the render queue, that triggers it. And in this case, adding something to the render queue does enable the update. However, when they render, it doesn't. And the key here is to always be listening for when the render is done. Using the update menu hook function, I can detect when something's added to the render queue, but there's nothing sent when they click render or anything like that. So it was kind of a false lead in terms of using the update menu hook. And at this point, I'm thinking, maybe we can do some kind of loop with the script, but again, that ruins the future proofing. Maybe we can interact with an extension that's running in the background constantly, doing an interval every second or so, and checking the render queue. Again, not future proof. So finally, after lots of testing, the last hope I found is the IdleHook. The idle hook is something that is run very often. I've read on the forums, sometimes it's run up to 60 or 30 times per second, which is a lot. But essentially, the idle hook is code that is run on a common interval very often. So without executing anything, this is just constantly running this function in the background as long as the plugin is installed. So what I found is that this is our way to do an interval. And I even left it as is. I think there are ways to increase or decrease the interval. I just left it as is. And what it does every time this interval is run, it does a whole bunch of checks. The first check is pretty obvious. It checks, well, is SuffixSlayer checked? If it's unchecked, there's no reason to run a bunch of code, maybe 30 times a second. What a waste. So only if SuffixSlayer is enabled is it going to go through this whole bit of code we're describing now. What it's doing is it's getting the number of render queue items. We don't need to go any further if there's no items in the render queue. So it does all of these checks just to be efficient. And if you're running an operation 30 times a second, for example, worst case scenario, you want it to be efficient in terms of not running code that's unnecessary. You don't want to trigger a bit of code 30 times a second if it's not necessary. If there are items in the render queue, we need to get the output path. Because in order to identify if an image sequence is going to be exported, the file path is always going to have this this kind of hashtag suffix right here. So that's what we look for. If it contains that suffix, we're going to continue. But furthermore, an image sequence with many frames is also going to have that suffix. So we need to check that the duration is a single frame long. So the first check, how many items are in the render queue? Second check, is any of those items have this image sequence identifier? Third check, is the render queue item a single frame? All of those conditions are met. Then we have a render queue item vector. This is just a variable which constantly keeps track of what's in the render queue. If any given item has been detected rendered from the render queue, which we have a get render state tool for that, then we need to remove that from our render queue vector. Essentially, this is the indicator that something's been rendered. When we have a list of items in the render queue and we detect that shall render equals 6. This is basically an int representing if it has been rendered or not. Using the AEGP get render state, there's a AEGP render item status type, and this has the following enumerations. It can tell you whether a render queue item will continue, needs output, is unqueued, queued, rendering, or is done. So this is checking, is it done? And if we've detected that it was an image sequence, all the other things, and the render indicates it was done, first, take that item out of the vector that we're dealing with. We have this thing, again, to track all of the things in our render queue. If we've detected it's rendered, get rid of it. And also, if we've detected it's rendered and got rid of it, the last thing to do is rename the file. So we have all of these checks that go down the line to make sure all these conditions are met. So just to recap all these technical details, if you're curious, first, you have to make sure that SuffixSlayer is enabled. Second, we have to make sure that there are items in the render queue. Third, the items in the render queue need to have the classic frame suffix indicator. Then it needs to also make sure it's a single frame. We don't want to interrupt multi-frame image renders. And then we are simply going to keep track of all of the things that we've identified match those particular properties. Then, once we detect it's been rendered, we remove it and rename the file that's been rendered. And with what seems like it would have been just a few lines of code with a script or an extension, we now have a SuffixSlayer, something that's constantly listening, as well as changing the name of any single frame rendered files. And I think creating a tool like this has kind of opened my mind to other things that I might be able to make utilizing this sort of IdleHook listening behavior. What other checkboxes can I toggle to make After Effects more featureful? But that's going to do it for this behind the scenes and detailed look at SuffixSlayer, my newest plugin for After Effects. Check it out in the link down below. You can get it for free or use the name your own price to donate, support me, or just get it for free, whatever you feel like. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.